the story for the very first time. And I try to imagine how the crowds are hearing what Jesus was saying to them. How did they interpret it? What was going on in their minds as he spoke? In this particular parable, we know that Jesus is speaking about something that they're all familiar with. Seeds and soil. They know this stuff. We know from last week that they definitely know about dirt. If you were here last week, we talked about dirt. They were surrounded by it. Jesus loved using images and things that were simple and familiar to talk about the most complex subjects. The kingdom of heaven, a pretty complex subject. He says, well, it's like a lost coin, or a pearl of great price, or even like a treasure buried in a field. It's like a seed, small at first, but once it grows, watch out. This morning, Jesus says it's like a sower who goes out to sow. Growing up hearing this parable, I discovered that I did what most of us probably have done. It's what we did last week. We listened to the story and we immediately began to try and label ourselves. Well, am I the path? Am I rocky soil? Am I covered with thorns, or is my soil good? What kind of soil am I? That's what we did last week. Do I have the depth of soil necessary for God's word to survive and grow within me? If not, what do I need to do to make it so? When I was in college, I learned that that's not actually the best way to look at the parable. Which means it could be argued that last week we were just looking at the parable all wrong. Hopefully you picked out a seed when you received your bulletin this morning. I have a bowl of seeds up here. Anybody not get a seed? You're not willing to admit you didn't get a seed, but I hope you got a seed. Some of you were able to pick a seed this morning. Hopefully all of you got a seed this morning. I want you to hold it in your hand. Get your seed out. I want you to hold it in your hand. And I want you to think about what it's going to take to make this seed grow. Think about your part in bringing life to that seed. Well, you know as well as I know that nothing is going to happen to the seed unless you plant it. You got to put it in the ground. You got to plant it. As a college student, I carried with me a small pea, a little pea that my pastor had given me. I carried it in the small pocket of my Bible that I had. And it reminded me of two things. First, it reminded me of all the people around me who have planted seeds in my life. The good, wise advice I got from members of my family, the books I had read, the music that I've listened to, the sermons that I've heard. You and I would not be sitting here today if it were not for the seeds that people planted in our lives. Second, it reminds me that I myself am a sower. Years ago, B. Fales, my pastor at the time, who was at my home church in Covington, Virginia, he stood from the pulpit in Granbury Memorial United Methodist Church. Have you been there, Dr. Tuttle? No. Well, it's in Covington. And he stood from the pulpit preaching on this parable, and I remember his exact words. He said that he had been reading this parable all wrong. He said the point of the parable is not to try and figure out what kind of soil you are, but the point of the parable rather is to recognize yourself as sowers. And he began to do this. He began to literally throw seed out into the congregation, just like that. I'm going to make our cleaning ladies really upset. But he just kept doing that. And he threw the seed out into the congregation, which is where I got my small little pea. To get his point across that you and I are sowers of God's word. God was giving us the seeds to sow. So, if B is right, if we didn't get here by ourselves, if people had impacted us by the seeds that had been sown in our lives, and we are sowers who are to take what has been sown in our lives and take God's word and sow it in the lives of others, if that's the point of this parable, it leads me to ask this question. How's the sowing coming along? How are you doing as sowers? stingy with God's word. To hoard it and to protect it. And to only let those seeds fall on ground that we know for certain will yield an abundant crop. Or to cast it only in the places where we can monitor it or keep our eye on it and control it. To cast where there is no guarantee would be just a complete waste, right? Seeds aren't cheap, at least in Jesus' time. Seed was expensive stuff. You had to be careful with it. But to be imitators of the sower in Jesus' parable means we got to cast our seed all over the place. On the good soil as well as the bad. The sower in the parable seemed to have an endless supply of seed, simply just throwing it everywhere. The seed just landed all over the place. The more he sowed, the more he seemed to have. And he didn't stop and pick up the seeds that fell on the path or along the rocks and try to move them. He gave them their chance. If the seed doesn't survive, I'll just try again next season. But he just scatters it everywhere. You know what the message says to me? It says to me that we have to keep sowing good news at every opportunity. Keep sowing that good news at work around those difficult colleagues. Keep sowing that good news at school among those kids who just think Jesus is a joke. Keep sowing that good news to that neighbor who is lost beyond lost. Anybody know anybody like that? You may never even see the harvest. It may not happen for 10 years. You may never even see it. But your seed at least touched them. And if you scatter enough seed at that rock-hard soil, maybe over time it'll break apart. But we're the sower, and you got to let go of it and just let what happened happen. Don't keep God's good news to yourself. Throw it out there. Let the seeds fall where they may. Let God do God's part. Here's a creative way of hearing our parable for this morning. Once upon a time, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell along the path. And the birds came along and devoured them. So he put his seed pouch down and spent the next hour or so stringing aluminum foil all around his field. He put up a fake owl he ordered from a garden catalog, and as an afterthought, he hung a couple traps for the Japanese beetles. Then he returned to his sowing, but he noticed some of the seeds were falling on rocky ground, so he put his seed pouch down again, and he went to fetch his wheelbarrow and his shovel. A couple hours later, he had dug up the rocks and was trying to think of something useful he could do with them, when he remembered his sowing and got back to it. But as soon as he did, he ran right into a briar patch, which was as sure as could be to strangle his little seedlings. So he sat his pouch down again, and he looked everywhere for the weed poison, but finally decided just to pull the thorns up by hand, which meant that he had to go back inside and look everywhere for his gloves. Now, by the time he had the briars cleared, it was getting dark, so the sower picked up his pouch and his tools and decided to call it a day. That night he fell asleep in his chair reading a seed catalog, and when he woke up the next morning, he walked out into the field and found a big cow sitting on his fake owl. He found rocks he had not found the day before, and he found new little leaves on the roots of the briars that he had broken off in his hands.